How much is known about the lives of women in ancient Rome? From breastfeeding to unusual beauty regimes, women who lived in the Roman Empire would have faced many of the same pressures as women in the modern world. Were girls allowed to be educated? And could women divorce their husbands? We brings you surprising facts about the lives of women in ancient Rome. Breast is best. Roman doctors thought so, but mothers weren't convinced. Wealthy Roman women did not usually breastfeed their own children. Instead, they handed them over to a wet nurse, usually a slave or hired freedwoman, who was contracted to provide this service. Serenus, influential author of a 2nd century work on gynecology, prescribed that a wet nurse's milk might be preferable in the days after the birth on the grounds that the mother could become too exhausted to feed. He did not approve of feeding on demand and recommended that solids such as bread soaked in wine should be introduced at 6 months. Serenus also pointed to the possible benefits of employing a Greek wet nurse who could pass on the gift of her mother tongue to her charge. Yet this flew in the face of advice from most Roman physicians and philosophers. They suggested that mother's milk was best, both for the child's health and moral character, on the grounds that wet nurses might pass on servile defects of character to the baby. These same men opined that women who did not suckle their own children were lazy, vain, and unnatural mothers who only cared about the possible damage to their figures. Growing up, Roman girls played with their own version of Barbie dolls. Childhood was over quickly for Roman girls. The law decreed that they could be married at as young as 12, thus capitalizing on their most fertile childbearing years at a time when infant mortality rates were high. On the eve of her wedding, a girl would be expected to put away childish things, including her toys. These same toys might be buried with her if she were to die before reaching marriageable age. In the late 19th century, a sarcophagus was discovered belonging to a girl named Creparia Tryphena, who lived in 2nd century Rome. Among her grave goods was an ivory doll with jointed legs and arms that could be moved and bent, much like the plastic figurines that some little girls play with today. The doll even came with a little box of clothes and ornaments for Creparia to dress her in. But in contrast to the much critiqued dimensions of a modern Barbie, Creparia's doll had wide, childbearing hips and a rounded stomach. Clearly, the message this young girl was expected to internalize was of her own future role as a mother, the achievement for which Roman women were most valued. Roman fathers, not mothers, usually got custody of their children after a divorce. Divorce was quick, easy, and common in ancient Rome. Marriage was the grease and glue of society, used to facilitate political and personal ties between families. However, marital ties could be severed at short notice when they were no longer useful to one or other party. Unlike today, there was no legal procedure to go through in getting a divorce. The marriage was effectively over when the husband, or more unusually the wife, said so. Fathers could also initiate a divorce on behalf of their daughters, thanks to the common practice of fathers retaining legal guardianship over their daughters even after their marriage. This arrangement enabled the bride's family to reclaim any dowry paid to the husband, thus keeping family fortunes intact. However, a few husbands tried to exploit a legal loophole that stated they could keep the dowry if, according to them, their wives had been unfaithful. Women may sometimes have been dissuaded from leaving their husbands due to the fact that the Roman legal system favored the father rather than the mother in the event of divorce. In fact, a Roman woman had no legal rights at all over her own children. The patrilineal relationship was all important. Sometimes, however, if it were more convenient to the father, children would live with their mothers after divorce, and strong ties of affection and loyalty might remain even after the breakup of a household. A famous example of this is the case of Emperor Augustus's daughter, Julia and her mother Scribonia, who was cast aside in favor of the emperor's third wife, Livia, when Julia was a newborn. When Julia was later also cast into exile by her father on account of her rebellious behavior, Scribonia voluntarily accompanied her grown-up daughter to the island of Ventetine, known in Roman times as Pandateria, where she had been banished. Roman women were under immense pressure to look good. In part, this was because a woman's appearance was thought to serve as a reflection on her husband, yet at the same time as women tried to conform to a youthful ideal of beauty, they were mocked for doing so. Roman poet Ovid gleefully admonished a woman for attempting a DIY dye job on her hair. "I told you to stop using rinses, now just look at you, no hair worth mentioning left to dye." In another satirical portrait by the writer Juvenal, a woman is said to have whipped the hairdresser who made a mess of her curly updo. There was clearly a thriving cosmetics industry in ancient Rome, though some recipes would probably win cautious modern approval for their use of recognized therapeutic ingredients such as crushed rose petals or honey. Others might raise eyebrows. Recommended treatments for spots included chicken fat and onion. Ground oyster shells were used as an exfoliant, and a mixture of crushed earthworms and oil was thought to camouflage gray hairs. Other writers spoke of crocodile dung being used as a kind of rouge. Such practices may simply be the mischievous inventions of satirists determined to poke fun at women's fruitless attempts to hold back the ravages of time. But it is clear from archaeological discoveries that the recipes for some beauty products were indeed somewhat bizarre. A small cosmetics container discovered at an archaeological dig in London in 2003 contained remnants of 2,000-year-old Roman face cream. When analyzed, it was found to be made from a mixture of animal fat, starch, and tin. The Romans believed in the education of women, up to a point. The education of women was a controversial subject in the Roman period. Basic skills of reading and writing were taught to most girls in the Roman upper and middle classes, while some families went further and employed private tutors to teach their daughters more advanced grammar or Greek. All of this was intended to facilitate a girl's future role in managing a household and to make her a more literate and therefore entertaining companion to her husband. Although very little writing by women is preserved from antiquity, that doesn't mean that women didn't write. Letters between soldiers' wives discovered at the Roman Fort of Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall illustrate something of the busy social scene of life on the frontier, and we know that Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, wrote a memoir which, much to historians' frustration, has not survived. However, many Romans believed that too much education could turn a woman into a pretentious bore. Worse still, intellectual independence could become a synonym for sexual promiscuity. Nevertheless, some elite families encouraged their daughters to cultivate an unusually educated persona, particularly if the family had a track record of intellectual achievement. Perhaps the most famous example of this is Hortensia, daughter of Cicero's great courtroom rival, Hortensius. She was one of very few Roman women to be celebrated for her abilities as a speechmaker, an accomplishment that was traditionally the exclusive preserve of men. In 42 BC, Hortensia stood on the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum and eloquently denounced the imposition of a tax imposed on Rome's wealthiest women to help pay for war.